Hey guys, so we're about an hour away from starting shooting on my new short film called Thrifted Hoodies. Basically, right now, we're at the end of pre-production, about to start normal production. We've got a screenplay written, of course, and I've got a variety of storyboards. I've storyboarded the whole thing from beginning to end. To take a step back, kind of the backstory behind wanting to make this short film is that I wanted to compete in Gerald Undone's film contest. Basically, the theme of the contest is low budget. So the goal is to make a short film under $2,500 in terms of camera, microphone, lights, and lenses. And after a bunch of thinking, I think I've got the right equipment for this. Let's see, today is Sunday, it's May 29th, and we're going to be shooting a few aspects of scene two. Scene two is the night scene. I'm sure if you've watched the movie at this point, you'll recognize that scene. And I think we're going to start off. We've got our two characters, Nick and Ethan. Nick is the guy who breaks into the house, and then Ethan is his friend who reluctantly kind of tags along. And today we're just going to try to shoot all the scenes that have Ethan in it. I've tried to become a little strategic with it. I know that my actors are going to show up kind of like right before the sun goes down. So we're going to try to shoot that very end of scene two right at blue hour in the hope that maybe we can pass that off as early morning. And then we're going to try to shoot the rest of the scene, which kind of takes place ideally in the pitch black of night. I've done extensive lighting tests, so I really hope that the lighting comes out okay. Due to the budget, I figured it would be smarter to get two lenses and one light rather than like one lens and two lights. So ultimately, we're going to try to light most of the scenes. We're going to use our light to represent moonlight. So we're going to backlight all the shots and occasionally use reflectors to try to add fill and as flags in order to cut light as well. Yeah, so I think that's probably a pretty good start to it. We'll see how shooting goes. I'm very excited and I can't wait to get into it. Hey guys, so right now we're in the editing room and I've more or less just kind of finished a rough cut of the short film. It turns out that with this short film contest, we have this like 4 minute time limit. And my first cut of this thing was like 4 minutes and 50 seconds long. If I cut everything like the way that I wanted to the first time, I definitely end up being overtime, we could say. It turned out that a lot of the skill that I had to use as an editor on this short film was actually just in trying to make it as short as possible and try to be as quick as I could where I could be quick. So let me actually cover like some of the tricks that I use to try to squeeze this thing into 4 minutes. I think the most obvious thing, of course, is to just be stingy with kind of like what sorts of emotional beats I have in the short film, right? So sometimes a certain moment, I might want to stretch that moment as long as possible. But if we're being honest, sometimes you could take half a second off of a shot or a full second off of a shot, and it's still 90% as good. The next thing that I did is that there are actions that are in the film where when we're recording it on set, actors maybe were doing an action that took longer than what I necessarily would have wanted, right? Like I want to illustrate that the actor is doing an action, like in this case, Sean, he's taking sweaters out of the drawer. He's trying to take them out slowly, right? But like when we actually shot it on set, he was taking them out like really slowly. So if I had like stuck on this like kind of medium shot that we have right here, if I stayed on this shot and played it out as it originally was, he actually takes quite a bit of time pulling that sweater out, and then he really lines it up with the bag and then puts it in. And what I've done here is I've cut to an alternative angle here to illustrate him grabbing the sweater. And then I've cut a little bit later to him holding the sweater up right before he puts it into his bag. So in the original shot here, Sean actually stuffs the sweater into his bag, and like I guess not all of it got in the first time, so then he puts it in, like he pushes the sweater into the bag 2 times in a row. And I've cut it here so that he only really puts it in once, and then he moves on to the next sweater. So sometimes you're able to save a little bit of time by condensing an action down, which you can sometimes do by cutting to a different angle and skipping part of the action. You can see here I've done a little cheat, right? So he's pulling the sweater out, and then across this cut, I've skipped to a little later in the action after the cut. Oftentimes you would cut to like slightly before, if I started at one clip and then if I end one clip and then I start at the next one, you'd switch to the next clip slightly before in time where the previous one ended so that you can really see the full action again. But in this case with Sean, I'm actually cutting to slightly after the previous clip ended because I know that I can get away with it a little bit. I can cheat a little bit and save like, 4 or 5 frames on a lot of shots. The third trick that I use to try to keep my editing a little rapid. Sometimes when you're cutting a short together, it feels like, oh, I want to have, this person's reaction and then that person's reaction. I want to capture everyone's face and I have a few different angles of a thing. And then I want to stretch out a moment like that. But then sometimes it turns out that if you just hold on a single action, if you hold on a single shot, then it feels slower than if you're cutting. Because every time you cut to the audience, it feels like some time has passed. You lose some time with every single cut. However, if you just stick to one shot, then you force the audience to wait and it feels longer than it really is. So sometimes rather than having several shots, I can replace it with one single shot that's overall faster than having several shots in a row, particularly if it's for a moment that has like a longer pause. So here's a time when I kind of use that. So I really hold on this shot of Tiffany with her phone and Sean in the background. And there might be an inkling in which you would want to just cut to a closer up of Sean and then maybe back to Tiffany as she's still here. But just by having this one long shot, it's something like almost like 4 seconds long. And I make you wait through it. And I feel like that sits a little bit longer and it feels slower perhaps than if I had done multiple shots in that time period, and that really sells the moment a bit more. All right, the next trick I did is with dialogue. So if we go to actually the first scene in the movie, Sean says, "God damn it, Bianca dumped me," and then my friend Sana, he replies, and we can actually see in the screenplay, if I pull that up, the second line here as written is, "What, just now?" And I realized that I could save time by removing some of these like filler words, particularly towards the beginning of the scene, where we haven't become emotionally invested yet. So I've scrubbed out the word "what" here. I've scrubbed out a few different words here and there. Here's another example of that. So I've got this wide shot of the two of them looking at each other. The original line for this bit of the scene was Nick starts off by saying, "What if," then he pauses like he's trying to think about it, and then he finishes the idea, "What if we broke into her house?" So he says "what if" twice. And I realized I could save a little bit of time again if I got rid of that first "what if," right? So that's been cut out. Probably the one thing that I did that saved the most time, I would say, is that I went through the whole like short film and I've made heavy use of J cuts and L cuts. So I guess the most obvious one is the very first shot, right? So here, this is a J cut. We hear the audio of Sean saying, "God damn it."
God damn it. Bianca.
Before we cut to him. That allows me to hold on to the wide shot, the establishing shot of the car. You have enough time to soak it in. Then here we've kind of done something similar. Hear Sean say,
"Yeah, she texted me that we're over."
We hear Sean say, "Yeah, she texted me we're over." You can see that we cut to Sean after we start to hear his audio. So here's an example of an L cut. So an L cut refers to when you cut away from the video before you cut away from the audio. So here's the example.
I shouldn't hold on to these, should I?
So Sean says, "Should I?" And then we've already cut to the reaction shot of the friend. You can see here it's shaped like an L, so the audio track extends further to the right than the video track does. Typically, I prefer the J cuts just because it's intuitive. When someone speaks, that grabs your attention and you want to look at them. And as a result, we cut to them at that time, right? So we have the audio come in first, and then that gets your attention. So then you look at the character, and that kind of follows a logical progression. But sometimes you can save a little bit of time with an L cut here because we're able to cut to a reaction a little bit earlier and then hold this pose for a little bit longer. So yeah, so I made heavy use of L cuts and J cuts almost whenever I could just to save time. So the next trick I used was using a smooth cuts, or I think in Premiere Pro they're called morph cuts, which is essentially like you have a jump cut, but then you disguise it by like there's this effect that creates a little morph and then a fade that tries to cover it up. And what you can do is you can find some shot in which your character isn't moving that much, but you want it to become a little bit shorter, right? So what you'll do is you'll find 2 frames in that shot that look very similar. You remove all the frames in between, and then you do a smooth cut over that transition. And there are like out-of-the-box effects for it. So actually, that's what I did here. So for this shot, we have Sanha, and he's looking at Sean, and then he delivers his line.
I know where we can take them.
The shot is really long, but I need it to begin with Sanha shaking his head, right? And then I have to wait until he delivers his line. Now, I instructed the actors to take their time with all the lines, because the worst is when it's too rushed and you have to like somehow find time to like put in, which is always a challenge. And I decided that it's preferable to remove time instead. And what I've done here is I've created this smooth cut that's right here, and the camera pans just very slightly between the two sides, but it's basically unnoticeable, I believe. Fortunately, Sana stayed very still during this shot while he's like waiting to deliver his line. So I think I was able to remove around a second there. There's another one that's at the beginning where Sana takes quite some time to read the phone. Now, obviously, I needed this shot to begin with him starting to lean in, and then he leans back and then says, "That sucks." Because he took a while to read the phone and I needed to save a little bit of time, I found that I could smooth cut just a little bit here of him like looking at the screen. And you can kind of see it a little bit, like it looks maybe like his jacket like shrinks a little bit or something, but honestly, if you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't have known, right? The last trick I use is occasionally I did a not a speed ramp, but I slowed down the footage and used optical flow to try to make it slower. I think slowing down a shot is kind of interesting because sometimes you can slow down a shot and then cut a little bit faster in a way. What I did for this shot here is that in the original take of this reaction, obviously this sequence is Sean looks up from the sweater and then he looks over at Sana and then says, "Oh, I shouldn't hold on to these," right? So during this original shot of Sana, funnily enough, he blinks a couple times, and every time an actor blinks, like on screen, you kind of sense that and you feel like time is passing a little faster than if they didn't blink at all. So even though he's essentially stationary during this whole shot, what I did is I slowed it down by like 50% or something. And that was solely so that I could make the shot the same length, but without him blinking. And then it feels longer. And then I can make it a little bit shorter to compensate for how it now feels a little bit longer. And that's like slowed down in post. So I'm using optical flow to try to extract the highest quality of frame interpolation, because I didn't record any of this in slow motion. So I shot all of this at 24 frames. So yeah, so I think that's a reasonable summary of sort of like the different kinds of tricks that I used to try to speed up the cut. It was a lot of work, like definitely like when I was 50 seconds over time, the first 30 seconds, that wasn't too hard to cut. But then after that, I really had to do all these tricks with like the J and L cuts and like the morph cuts. And with all of those, I was able to cut it down to just the right amount of time. So I'll get back to you guys when we're in the color grading process, and we'll see how that goes. Hey guys, so as promised, in the last video I told you I'd be back in the color grading suite. Here we are, the same room, but now it's my color grading suite. Basically, today I've essentially declared that the short film is complete. So I think it's a good time to kind of talk about the rest of the post-production process, you know, after we finished editing. So today I'd planned to talk about color, but I also want to talk about a few other things. So the color that you get in the final film is dependent on a few things. So one is going to be sort of what your post-production pipeline looks like, right? Like what you're doing to white balance and exposure, and what kind of look that you have, and how you do your HDR to SDR conversions. But the other big factor is going to be from your lighting and your choice of camera. Now, for this specific film contest that I'm submitting this to, there's this $2,500 price limit that I had to deal with. So I think let's start off by talking about how I chose the camera for this short film. Seeing the low overall budget for the short film, I definitely had to be a little picky with what kind of camera to use. So I think I had basically, let's say, three main options, right? So I have this Panasonic GH4 that I use for a few of my short films that you can check out on my channel. In particular, the Lie Detective one, A Problem for the Cleaners, and Two Steps Back. These were all shot on the Panasonic GH4. That camera does have a few benefits. One is that right now it's really cheap. It does shoot 4K. The downside is mostly that it shoots 8-bit, and it doesn't really shoot in like a nice log format unless you pay $100 for the 8-bit log upgrade that you can get for it. I never paid for that, to be honest, so I don't have it. The next camera that I could choose was actually the camera that we're looking at right now. So this is the Sony ZV-1. It's a point and shoot camera, so I definitely wouldn't have as much freedom in terms of lens selection, but it does shoot in some log formats, again, in an 8-bit format. So pretty much the same downsides as the GH4, except you don't have the choice of lenses and it costs more. So that's definitely ruled out. And basically the third option that I had was the Blackmagic Micro Cinema camera, which I had bought in like 2018 or something. Even though that camera is only 1080p, I know that it has these better codecs. It has this log format that's supported by DaVinci Resolve. It can shoot RAW, which is actually the codec that I decided to shoot this whole thing on. I shot it in the compressed 3:1 RAW format that's provided in the Blackmagic Micro Cinema camera. While that camera does cost the most out of these options, I figured I paid about $900 for it, maybe $800, somewhere in that range, $800 to $900. And nowadays you can get similar packages still for $900. So I figured with that kind of price, I could still leave a lot of money towards lenses and lighting and the microphone. So that was ultimately the strategy that I chose. And I knew that I could probably get like at least a decent color grade out of it. And I could definitely use like a scene referred pipeline, which is what I think the state of the art is right now for color grading. So on top of the camera, there are two other things that affect your color. So the first one is going to be how you light your scenes. Obviously with this contest, we were very limited in terms of what kind of lights I could have. So I just had a single light. I pretty much used almost no modifiers on it other than like gels or like the barn doors. I just backlit pretty much all the scenes because I feel like a backlight is the kind of light direction that adds the most production value to any kind of shoot. So, due to budget limitations, I was kind of limited in terms of lighting. I was really thinking about compromising on lenses and shooting on vintage Canon FD glass, mostly because they're cheaper lenses. Therefore, that would give me the budget to use 2 lights instead of 1. I opted against that mostly because Canon FD glass is not very sharp, especially when you're using such a tiny sensor, which is what you have in the BMM-CC. So, yeah, ultimately I went with the Rokinon Cine DS lenses, which in terms of color, they're fine, right? They look neutral enough. That's not going to be a limiting factor for us. But I made the poor strategic choice of using the cheapest ND filters that are on the market. So obviously, a lot of the scenes in this short film are shot during the day and it's very bright. I'm using these fast T1.5 lenses. I'm using a speed booster, so effectively they're like almost like T.9. So I have a lot of light coming into the camera and I want to maintain my shallow depth of field. So the way to do that without stopping down the lens, of course, or cranking up the shutter speed is to use ND filters. So here's an ND filter that I used. This is a 4-stop ND filter. The problem is I got all my ND filters in this like bundle from Tiffin, which everyone knows is not necessarily known for high quality filters. And I was definitely getting the cheapest filters you could. Like a good ND filter is like $100, right? And I got 3 different filters for $100. As a result, these filters have a substantial green color cast to them, which became an enormous headache in the color grading room. And on top of that, my first and last scenes in the movie are all shot in a car. And you'll notice some of the shots shot through the windshield, like this one, right? So essentially there are like 4-ish angles that you can use when shooting people in a car. You can go through the passenger or driver's side windows, or you can try to shoot kind of inwards through the windshield, which is what I did here and in a few other shots. Obviously there's some shots like this one where you can kind of just shoot through the front of the car, or you could do what I did right after this, shoot from the back windows, which has the downside of crossing the 180-degree line, which I did very knowingly for these 2 shots before going back to the front. Whenever you shoot through a windshield, you have to be conscientious that, like these cheap-ass ND filters, the windshield was not exactly engineered for the purpose of minimal color cast. Instead, the windshield actually has this fairly heavy green tint to it, and these ND filters have more green tint. And I was also using a polarizer, stacking up all these filters together and whatnot in order to get as much ND as I needed. And as a result, a lot of my shots ended up having these crazy like green like skin tones, this loss of contrast from all the reflections and this flaring that comes out as you're shooting like this. And then on top of that, if light was hitting the lens, even like bounced off of the hood of the car or something and hitting the lens, we got this terrible flaring, which I've mostly been able to correct, but you'd see this kind of like magenta flaring at the very top and bottom edges of the frame Maybe that has to do with the speed booster or like the OLPF in the camera or something like that. But whatever causes it, it's ugly. And maybe if I had spent more money on the right glass, I could have avoided some of these things. Let me show you what the Blackmagic Micro Cinema camera looks like. So I know it's in the video, but here you can see it. It's this little guy right here. It's like this little box that kind of hides right behind the lens and whatnot. And I've got an external display for it because, you know, this camera doesn't have one. And I've got a speed booster on it, so that's how we're able to get kind of a good speed. Follow focus on the right side, handle for holding, battery plate. That's pretty much the kind of setup that I was working on. Cheap NDs on the front. So let's kind of go over my overall color grading pipeline. I'm not going to say that I'm the best colorist, but I do know kind of like the math behind it. And for this project, unlike my previous ones where sometimes I used ACEs or RCM or some kind of like strange abomination of the two, for this one I decided to do something a little bit different. So we imported the footage using our these kinds of camera raw settings. So I just used the color temperature that I shot on site. I did turn on highlight recovery because that gives you a free like half stop of dynamic range at the top. I did try to expose to protect my highlights, but in a couple cases, you know, the highlights did get a little bit clipped. Basically, my pipeline has 3-ish main stages. So the first thing I do, as you should in any kind of color managed pipeline, is I'm going to take the Blackmagic design film. I'm going to take the original kind of color space of the footage. I'm going to transform it into our working color space. In this case, I chose DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate. Why did I choose that? Well, DaVinci Intermediate has a wide dynamic range. DaVinci Wide Gamut is a corresponding color gamut. That's pretty much all the logic I used. Well, then we applied noise reduction and did a couple basic effects. Following that, I immediately convert to linear. So I convert from our log color space, our log working space, into linear. I use this linear gamma for all of the clip-based adjustments. So I've got flare control. So as I said, these NDs and the window and all this stuff, like oftentimes there is kind of like this this gross looking flaring. In the case of this shot, it was really extreme, right? Like there'd be almost no contrast in this shot if I didn't remove it. Flare adjustments in scene linear are really convenient. You just use the offset control. So that's plussing and minusing values to all pixels. Next up, I had a couple RGB matrices that I used to fix the color problems that were associated with shooting through all this different glass. We've got white balance and exposure adjustments. We've got power windows. We've got vignetting. For the most part, you know, exposure and white balance and the vignette, these all could just be easily done in scene linear using gain, which is nice because that's one of the wheels on my control panel. With these windshield and these guys, these are 3x3 RGB matrices. Where did I come up with these? I'll tell you in a bit. And then finally, when we're done with all the clip-based adjustments, we're going to go back into DaVinci Intermediate, our working color space, and move on to kind of like the overall look that I've crafted for this short film. This look is pretty minimal, not going to lie. First, we got a bloom adjustment. So bloom is essentially like light comes into the lens, it's scattered, aka blurred, and that blurred part gets added onto the light that reaches your photo sight. So this is a blur that's then added to our image. It's sandwiched by some log to linear conversions. Halation is the same thing as bloom, except the blur is less, and instead of just being the same color, it's red. Then we've got some contrast and split toning adjustments. I've got this magenta correction to fix this like disgusting like magenta flare that often lies at the top and bottom of the frame when I stack up all these ND filters and shoot into the bright light. And then we've got some sharpening. And then finally at the timeline level, I've got a global brightness adjustment, and I convert to HDR. And because I'm monitoring on a SDR display, I convert to SDR, but these two nodes could be combined into the same node, which is this one that I have here. So that's pretty much the whole pipeline. Let's go into some of the exciting nitty-gritty technical details for you guys. So obviously kind of the crux of my whole pipeline here is this ability to construct a scene linear image from the camera's output. For those of you who aren't familiar with the terminology, scene linear is a color space in which the pixel's code value is directly proportional to the number of photons that pixel represents. So what does this mean? Well, so photographically speaking, when you raise your exposure by one stop, it's understood that you, say, for example, open up your aperture or increase the duration that the shutter is open by a factor of 2, allowing in twice as many photons to hit the sensor, and we say that's a one-stop increase in the amount of light. Now, if I want to increase the exposure by one stop in scene linear, I just go over to my gain control and I raise it to 2, and boom, now I've one more stop of light represented by that code value. Assuming that my mapping of like the camera's files to scene linear is correct, then I will have made an adjustment that is equivalent to if I had raised the exposure by one stop when I had shot the image. So with varying light conditions, I may often need to make exposure adjustments in post, and to be able to do this in a photographically accurate way gives me a big advantage and allows me to better match different clips. By a similar logic, flaring, physically speaking, flare is like when I've just added a bit of light to an image. So like in the simplest case, I've added like a single value to all pixels, so I can subtract that value if I can guess it correctly, and that's how I'm able to recover this terrible loss of contrast that we have in this shot and make it into something that's more acceptable. So those are a couple of the operations that we can do in scene linear. Probably the last one that's relevant is going to be white balance, which is essentially also a gain adjustment. I'd just be moving this knob one way or another, applying a different gain to each of the RGB channels. So in order to reach scene linear, of course, we need to have a mapping from the camera's files. You know, in this case, we're decoding in this Blackmagic Design film, log space, and then eventually through this transformation and this transformation, I convert from Blackmagic Design film to linear. Now, that sounds easy enough. There is a complication of doing this. Pretty much the main reason I shot RAW was that I understand that RAW files can be decoded to a scene linear pretty much directly. Now, unfortunately, Resolve doesn't actually give that option unless I wanted to use a Rec 709 color space or a DCI P3 or something rather than the original camera's primaries. However, that shouldn't be a problem. The Blackmagic Design film gamma, we do have a conversion through the color space transform in which we can go to linear. However, it turns out that this doesn't always do the right thing. Now, you might say, why is that, right? Like, why would this color space transform be wrong, right? Well, so it turns out my camera is made by Blackmagic Design, and this software that I'm using here, DaVinci Resolve, is also made by Blackmagic Design. So what Blackmagic has done is they've decided to do a vertical integration. They made it so that in DaVinci Resolve, when it sees this metadata tag in your camera raw files that says that the camera model is a Blackmagic camera, they will actually go in and kind of treat the footage a little bit differently than they otherwise would. Here's an example, right? So here I have two clips, this one and this one here, which DaVinci Resolve has correctly recognized as originating from the Blackmagic Micro Cinema camera. I shot these two clips one stop and exposure apart. So the first thing I do is, we decode into Blackmagic Design film. Then I'm going to convert from Blackmagic Design film into linear. And then in the case of like this clip, I'm going to apply a gain of 0.5 to drop it down by one stop. Then I'm going to convert from linear to Rec 709. So we can see that while these two clips look pretty similar, we can see in the waveform that you do see some difference when we click between them, right? Essentially, we can see that the code values have kind of shifted, and my 0.5 gain adjustment, it doesn't successfully match one clip to the other. So I found out that if I go ahead and remove this tag from the original DNG files, DaVinci Resolve won't realize that the footage was shot on a Blackmagic camera, and then they'll actually treat it correctly. So here I have literally the same two clips as these, but on the right, I've removed that tag. I didn't remove it in DaVinci Resolve. I removed it elsewhere. I've removed that tag, and now these two clips actually match, as we can see on the waveform, substantially better with the same two grades as what I had here, except I've removed that little tag. So now it actually decodes into the Blackmagic Design film color space correctly, that gamut correctly. It's able to properly convert that to linear, and my 0.5x gain adjustment actually virtually perfectly matches these two clips. How did we do that? Well, to get into the nitty-gritty details, here I've made this this little Python script that takes in a folder of CDNG files and then goes through, and for every single DNG file, it removes that metadata tag. and honestly, it's super slow. But I did that for all of my clips in this Thrifted Hoodies project, and I'll put a link to this GitHub in the description of this video, and you can run that too if you happen to be running one of these like 8-year-old Blackmagic cameras that are totally out of date. So essentially with that program, I was able to go through and be able to trust my whole pipeline and make sure that I could trust that it'd be converted to linear correctly. So as I said before, now that I'm able to convert to scene linear correctly, I'm able to do some of these nice, convenient mathematical operations to properly make adjustments to color space and like exposure and white balance and whatnot. So one of the things that you can do is you can apply these 3x3 RGB matrices in scene linear, and they can be used to transform from one color space to another or to calibrate between two different cameras and whatnot. Now, once you introduce a filter or piece of glass in front of the sensor, you then could have a shift in your colors, and therefore you will need, potentially, depending on how bad your filters are, you will need to convert from one color space to another, essentially. Although the camera is shooting in a specific color space, by changing what spectrum of light passes through the lens, your color primaries can effectively change. So in order to figure out what matrices to use for these, first we've got like our stack of filters, and then we often have this windshield in front of the car that has this terrible green color cast to it, right? So I had to profile what these different pieces of glass looked like and then derive the best RGB matrix in order to match these different shots, because over the course of the shoot, I'm either shooting through the windshield or I'm shooting through one of the left and right side windows. I needed all these shots to be able to match each other, of course. So what I did is I made sure that for each kind of like stack of glass that's between the camera and the subject, I've shot a color chart in order to be able to match these things. So here I've got a shot where there's no filters. These all have different color grades on them, but here's one in which I have the 4-stop ND filter. Here I've got the ND filter with the polarizer, so we can kind of see. Well, I guess maybe the polarizer is the one that brings in this disgusting like magenta flaring that we had on the top and bottom. And then here I've shot through the windows. I've shot directly so that I could match these, like the windshield to the not windshield shot. And then for this flashback sequence, I stacked up all my filters in order to try to get the depth of field that I wanted in this blasting sunlight. So I've shot this too, and you can see we've got this horrific yellow color cast. So being able to match these to these, you know, is somewhat non-trivial. So here's how I did it. So the methodology I used in order to match the cameras in these different kinds of color settings is I took each of these different kinds of images that we had, and I basically cropped them in so that we just had the color chart for each of these, and I was able to make these different kinds of reference shots for these different scenarios. And I exported each of these as EXR files in scene linear. Then I had this program that I made in which I use PyTorch to try to fit a 3x3 matrix to convert from one scene linear image to the other. And on top of that, I also allow for kind of an offset so that my flare correction can be factored in. Because if one image has this flare and a color shift, then I have to be able to match that to an image that has neither of those things, right? So I had this program that computes what kind of flare to use, and then what kind of color correction matrix to shift the primaries over to a more acceptable spot. So link to this GitHub will also be in the description below. What it's able to do is we read in like this EXR file, and then I grab like a patch from like a color patch from each of these spots, and then I'm able to derive the right 9 parameters or maybe 12 parameters depending on what version of the code you're running that kind of best fits one to the other. So I was able to save the RGB matrices that I made as a power grade, and then I just like drag and drop them onto the relevant clips. This project had a handful of VFX shots. Now, almost nothing flashy happened in this short film, but that doesn't mean that I can't have VFX shots in it. The VFX that I usually find myself doing is just cleanup work to make up for sloppiness when shooting or performance errors that I didn't notice. So some of the changes I made were performance changes. So Sana was driving my car and he drove it very slowly, which I appreciate because it's quite safe. But when he drove the car to kind of like bring it to a stop here, he was actually driving so slowly that I had to speed up the clip by like 200% in order to make sure that we fit in the 4-minute time limit. As a result, when you speed up a clip, obviously when the wind blows and it moves the foliage around, they're going to be like shaking just a little bit too much, and it's not going to really look realistic. So here's a VFX shot where when we speed up the clip, make it so that the car goes faster, I've gone through and I've rotoscoped out the car, and then I tracked in the background from the normal speed version. And from there, I was able to get these trees to blow in the wind in a more reasonable kind of way. In addition to performance changes, there were times when there's just something that was in the frame that I wanted to remove. So as an example here, this frame looks pretty nice, but what if I told you that originally when we shot this specific shot, there's something out that window that was unappealing, and that is there's this little snail drive slow sign, watch out for kids kind of thing back there. We shot 2 shots of Sana here going through the whole scene, and after the first one I saw this sign, I was like, well, you know what, I don't think these colors are going to look good for the final short film. So I went back there and I moved it 4 feet to the right so that it'd be out here, and I scooted the camera around so that I'd have less of Sean's face over here and whatnot. And in the times when I did like the performance more for this first shot in which the snail was back there, I had to go in and post and kind of take the window from the second shot and blur that in there and hope that no one's really looking at the background at the end of the day, right? So, I guess occasionally sometimes the wind will blow differently in our little patch here than it did in the original footage. So sometimes there might be a mismatch where one thing is moving and the other thing isn't moving, but overall, it seems like it's okay. So we did something similar to that over here, except this one, I also have a performance adjustment. But if I play it throughly, you'll see that Sana never blinks in this clip. In the original clip, which also had the snail, Sana actually blinks 2 times. So how did we fix that? How did I eliminate his blinking for this shot? So I'll show you what I did here. So over here, we're in Fusion, and here we've got kind of the final shot. What I did is I identified a portion of this clip, which happens like 3 seconds before the part where we use this shot, in which Sana isn't blinking because he's watching a different part of Sean's performance. So I've tracked Sana's eyes based off of the glasses, and I've identified the segment of time in which his eyes are open, and then I've tracked his eyes into the shot, match moved them, and then merged them right on top. So here we can kind of see like before, after. And then I pretty much did the same thing with the right side as well. We're able to kind of work the right eye in. It's not perfectly aligned, but I bet you didn't notice. And then we add noise and sharpening and all this stuff in order to try to make the footage really match. So there are a couple changes in there in which I had to use some VFX tricks in order to like make it so that he didn't blink quite as much as he did in camera. And we could argue here that these shots here are kind of VFX shots. The reality was that in order to shoot through a windshield, what you have to do is you have to have like, you have your windshield, and then you put like this flag on top of the camera and all that so that you create this shade, and so that the reflection off of the windshield just goes into this black piece of cloth. So then the reflection therefore adds 0 light, hence the offset that I used to remove flare. Now, one problem I ran into was that my flag is only as large as about half of the windshield. So as a result, this is kind of more what these clips looked like, right? So I stitched together 2 halves of this shot, which one looks like this. I can't perfectly show it right now, but the other one, it's also only half, but I've masked it out like this, right? So that I can have these 2 things at the same time, and therefore get the full shot together. And I think the most complicated VFX shot in the short film is the last shot of the short. Let's take a look at this frame real quick, and let's see what the original shot looked like. So here we can see we've got this guy who's been walking out of the Goodwill. Then we also have this guy who's going to be walking in towards the Goodwill. Then also I shot this shot while Sean and Sana weren't available. So the car is driven by my brother, and there's clearly nobody in the passenger seat. So what I had to do here is I had to make a plate out of this bit of the Goodwill store, and then I rotoed out, all the parts that the car doesn't touch. I had to make a plate to remove this guy, and then I made the windows darker in order to try to reduce attention. going to this kind of spot, which very unfortunately is silhouetted out by this like bright white Prius that's back there. So let's see how that looks right here for this frame. So we can see here that I've made this window substantially darker. This guy's gone. I managed to make that work. You can still kind of see through the car, but like I think it grabs your attention less, and therefore you might not notice in the first couple viewings. That's really all I had to do, you know, in order to kind of sell that, right? Like, it's not about digitally adding another person so that it would be impossible to tell. It's just about making it so that you wouldn't pay attention to it. You wouldn't notice the flaw, and the flaw wouldn't distract you. Yeah, so I guess the final stage to any one of these kinds of video projects is going to be the export. So when we're in the color page, on the very last bit, as I covered earlier, I think, we take our DaVinci Intermediate image. I have this like global exposure adjustment that I apply. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to follow this chain out. So I convert to HDR without any OOTFs. Pretty sure we should need a forward OOTF, but like my results always looked worse if I turned that box on. And then while I'm color grading, I have this HDR to SDR conversion so that I can hopefully know what the HDR grade is going to look like, even though I'm grading on a Rec 709 monitor. Now I do check my HDR grades by playing the video back on like my TV and my MacBook and whatnot. I think delivering your YouTube videos in HDR adds a lot of value because anyone who's watching on an HDR monitor will get the benefits of like this reduced macro blocking in the shadows and just overall better reduction of compression artifacts. So what I'll do is I'll disable the HDR to SDR conversion, then I go over to export and I set the proper color space and gamma tags in the export at 10-bit. Yeah, 10-bit here. And then we're almost done. We're almost ready to upload it to YouTube. But there's actually one more step after we smash that render button. YouTube has all this information about uploading high dynamic range videos and what all you should do. But I personally really dislike the YouTube HDR to SDR conversion. I want to make sure that our viewers who are watching on standard dynamic range monitors get an appropriate kind of image. So YouTube actually provides instructions on how to control the SDR conversion. So what I've done is I took my HDR to SDR conversion that I used while color grading this thing, and I've exported just this node, just this transformation as a 3D LUT. Then what I did is I followed the YouTube provided instructions, which take you to this metadata tool. The metadata tool like takes in an input video file and adds like some tags for like color matrices and whatnot. These probably aren't necessary, but most importantly, you can throw in a kubelet, which can be attached to the file. And then YouTube, when you upload your HDR grade, it will use this kubelet to make the Rec 709 versions of the stream. So I'm going to put a link to this GitHub and the YouTube HDR specs in the description below. So after I've exported the file, what I do is I run this little script that I've got right here, which takes the HDR to SDR kubelet file, and then we're going to attach it to my export and then kind of write the whole thing as an MKV that I can upload. And then we also throw in a bunch of other metadata tags that YouTube recommends. There we go. So that's how I end up with the final video that you guys have all watched. Really appreciate you guys sticking through with this whole series, and especially this ultra long video, super marathon post-production thing. I'll see you guys again in like a year when I do my next short film. So y'all have a good one.